What if the secret to making American bombers nearly indestructible wasn't thicker armor, but knowing precisely where not to place it? By the end of World War II, B-17 flying fortresses were limping home with engines destroyed, fuselages torn open, and entire tail sections barely attached. Aircraft that should have fallen from the sky instead crossed hundreds of miles of enemy territory and landed with their crews alive. The reason wasn't luck. It was mathematics, and the insight of a refugee statistician who realized that the most important data was missing entirely. On February 1, 1943, high above Tunisia, Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg guided his B-17 back toward Allied airspace after a bombing run over Tunis. The formation had scattered under enemy pressure when Bragg heard a sound that froze his blood, the rising whine of a Messerschmitt Bf 109 accelerating into a head-on attack. This time, the German fighter didn't pull away. The pilot, likely already dead or unconscious, slammed directly into the rear fuselage of the bomber at a combined speed exceeding 350 miles per hour. Metal screamed as the fighter's wing tore through the aircraft like a blade. The left horizontal stabilizer vanished. A jagged gash 16 feet long ripped open the fuselage. Nearly every control cable was severed. The tail section, with the tail gunner trapped inside, was connected to the rest of the aircraft by little more than twisted aluminum skin and a handful of structural stringers. By every rule of aerodynamics, the aircraft should have disintegrated. Instead, the bomber, later known as the All-American, stayed airborne. For 90 agonizing minutes, Bragg and his co-pilot fought the controls as the aircraft tried to climb and roll unpredictably. Crewmen in the waist section stared through open air where the fuselage had been, watching the tail flex independently with every movement. The structure groaned under loads it was never meant to carry. Yet the bomber refused to die. Against all odds, the All-American landed safely in Algeria. All 10 crew members survived. Only after everyone evacuated did the battered tail finally collapse onto the runway. This was not an isolated miracle. Throughout the war, B-17s returned with damage so severe that engineers struggled to explain how they remained airborne at all. Wings held on by a single spar. Engines shot away entirely. Hundreds of flak holes stitched through skin and structure. And yet, they came back. The question was why. In 1942, the U.S. Army Air Forces were losing bombers at an alarming rate. On some missions, nearly a third of the aircraft failed to return. Commanders knew armor was needed, but armor meant weight, and weight meant reduced range, altitude, and survivability. The challenge wasn't whether to add protection. It was deciding where it mattered most. The military did what seemed obvious. Engineers examined every returning bomber and mapped the bullet holes. The data was clear. The fuselage, wings, and tail were riddled with damage. Logic dictated reinforcing exactly those areas. Then Abraham Wald said they were wrong. Wald was a Hungarian-born mathematician who had fled Austria after the Nazi annexation. By 1942, he was working in Manhattan with the Statistical Research Group at Columbia University, a classified think tank tasked with solving military problems using mathematics rather than intuition. When presented with the bullet hole maps, Wald didn't calculate how much armor to add. He asked a different question. Where are the bullet holes that aren't here? The aircraft being studied were survivors. Every one of them had been hit in those locations and still made it home. The bombers that didn't return, the ones destroyed in midair, were missing from the dataset entirely. And those aircraft had been struck in different places: engines, cockpits, critical control systems. The bullet holes that mattered most were invisible. Wald had identified a fundamental flaw in human reasoning, what would later be called survivorship bias. By focusing only on what survived, planners were reinforcing the wrong conclusions. Armor didn't belong where planes were hit and survived. It belonged where hits caused planes to disappear. The military was skeptical. The idea sounded backward. But Wald's logic was unassailable. His classified memoranda redirected armor to engines, pilot compartments, control cable junctions, areas where even a single hit often meant total loss. The results were immediate. Bomber survival rates improved. Crews who would have become statistics made it home. And yet, the B-17's toughness wasn't just mathematical. It was engineered into its bones. Boeing had built the flying fortress with layers of redundancy that bordered on excessive. The wings used a dual spar design, allowing one spar to carry the load if the other failed. Load paths were distributed through multiple attachment points, each capable of compensating if others were destroyed. The stressed aluminum skin wasn't merely a shell, it was structural, allowing the aircraft to retain integrity even with massive holes torn through it. Control systems were duplicated. Primary cables ran protected routes, with backups following different paths entirely. Even the trim tabs had independent controls, allowing pilots to fly using trim alone if the main system was destroyed. Each engine operated independently. The radial design meant cylinders could be lost while the engine continued running. Air cooling eliminated vulnerable radiators. Self-sealing fuel tanks closed bullet holes automatically. Fuel lines shut themselves off if severed. And above all, the B-17 was stable. With proper trim, the aircraft would fly straight and level without human input. That stability saved countless crews when pilots were wounded or controls damaged. The aircraft wanted to stay in the air. When Wald's insight was layered onto this already resilient design, the flying fortress became something extraordinary, not invulnerable, but brutally difficult to kill. By late 1943 and into 1944, loss rates began to fall. Crews still died. Aircraft were still destroyed. But the odds shifted, and the true power of Wald's discovery was only beginning to reveal itself, not just in the skies over Europe, but in how humans would learn to interpret data, risk, and survival itself. There were cases, officially documented, quietly whispered about among crews, of B-17s flying themselves home after everyone aboard had bailed out. Aircraft landing in fields or skidding to a halt with no one at the controls, engines still running, trim set just right. Machines refusing to fall, even when abandoned. That wasn't an accident. The Flying Fortress had been designed with combat damage in mind long before America entered the war. Boeing engineers studied World War I wreckage, mapped failure points, and assumed that everything would eventually be hit. Electrical systems had primary and backup generators. If both failed, batteries powered essential controls. Radios came in layers, command sets, liaison radios, emergency transmitters. Oxygen systems were distributed with multiple regulators and portable bottles. Heating circuits were duplicated because at 25,000 feet, frostbite arrived in minutes and death followed soon after. Every system assumed failure and planned for survival anyway. But engineers still thought like engineers. They protected what they could see break. Wald protected what caused planes to vanish. Once armor was added to engines, cockpit sections, and control junctions, the B-17's natural resilience multiplied. A few pounds of steel around magnetos or oil pumps prevented catastrophic fires. Armored glass windshields stopped rounds that once killed pilots instantly. Shielded control runs prevented single hits from turning bombers into falling coffins. Not every unit understood the logic. Some crews added unauthorized armor where flak hit most often, degrading performance without improving survivability. But where Wald's guidance was followed precisely, the results were unmistakable. The All-American proved it. After the collision over Tunisia, Lieutenant Bragg faced a decision no pilot should ever have to make. Bail out over enemy territory, or stay with an aircraft that could tear itself apart at any second. He chose to stay. As the bomber limped toward Algeria, another horror emerged. The tail wheel was in the damaged section. Steering on landing would be impossible. Worse still, the tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Sam Sarles, was trapped. The floor connecting him to the fuselage was gone. If the tails separated, he would die instantly. Bragg ordered the rest of the crew forward, stacking survival odds where they could. Sarles remained alone in the tail, guns manned, fully aware that he might be riding a detached section of aircraft to his death. The landing was violent. The damaged tail whipped with each bounce. Metal screamed. The left wing scraped the ground. But the aircraft held together long enough. Only after every man was clear did the tail finally collapse. The All-American would be repaired and fly again. So would hundreds of others. There was Wee Willie, which survived 128 missions before finally being destroyed on its 129th. There were bombers counted with over 800 flak holes. Aircraft that returned missing entire engines, wings attached by little more than hope and rivets. These stories became legend, but they also obscured a harsher truth. For every bomber that limped home, others never did. Before Wald, those losses were seen as random. Bad luck. Fate. After Wald, they became evidence. German fighter pilots didn't need statistics to find weak points. Through brutal repetition, they learned where bombers died. Engines, cockpits, control surfaces. Their tactics evolved accordingly: head-on attacks, engine-focused fire, cockpit bursts. Planes that took those hits didn't survive to be studied. Wald broke the cycle by recognizing what wasn't being counted. His vulnerability indices quantified loss probabilities. A hit to an engine dramatically increased destruction likelihood. Cockpit hits were worse. But fuselage damage, the most visible damage on surviving aircraft, barely moved the needle. The military resisted at first. Some officers argued Wald didn't understand combat. He hadn't flown missions. He hadn't watched friends die. But mathematics didn't need courage. It needed truth. Wald worked among giants at Columbia: economists, statisticians, decision theorists, all quietly reshaping warfare from chalkboards and probability tables. Submarine search patterns, depth charge dispersal, anti-aircraft accuracy. Wald's work became foundational to military operations research and remained classified for decades. Its influence didn't stop with bombers. Survivorship bias appeared everywhere once named. In finance, only winning funds are advertised. In medicine, only surviving patients are studied. In business, success stories drown out silent failures. In architecture, only buildings that didn't collapse remain to be admired. The missing cases shape reality more than the visible ones. By late 1944, bomber losses plummeted. Escort fighters closed the gap. Armor went where it mattered. Crews who once faced coin-flip survival odds now believed they might finish their tours. The B-17G became the ultimate expression of these lessons. Chin turrets to counter frontal attacks, refined gun placements, armor exactly where Wald's analysis demanded. 13. 50 caliber machine guns created overlapping defensive fire. But even then, the aircraft's greatest strength wasn't firepower. It was forgiveness. Boeing had overbuilt the B-17 by nearly 30%. Critics once called it wasteful. Combat proved it essential. Of the 12,731 B-17s built, roughly 4,600 were lost in combat. A staggering number, yet nearly two-thirds survived the most intense aerial war in history. Many flew dozens of missions under conditions no aircraft should endure. The crews were young, often barely out of their teens. 10 men trusting each other in an aluminum structure at 5 miles above hostile ground. Pilots, navigators, bombardiers, engineers, radio operators, waist gunners, ball turret gunners, tail gunners, isolated, exposed, watching tracers rise toward them. Contrary to myth, ball turret gunners had lower casualty rates than waist gunners standing at open windows. The most dangerous positions were exactly where Wald predicted: the nose and cockpit. As losses fell, morale rose. Crews volunteered for second tours, something unimaginable in 1943. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was broken. Bombers flew with minimal opposition. The final B-17 mission over Europe dropped food, not bombs, feeding a starving population instead of destroying it. After the war, most flying fortresses were scrapped, melted into raw aluminum. Their legacy survived. Abraham Wald did not. In 1950, he died in a plane crash in India, 48 years old. A cruel irony for a man who saved so many airmen. But his insight endures. Every time someone asks what data is missing, every time success stories are questioned, every time invisible failures are considered, the lesson repeats. The B-17 earned its name through redundancy, courage, and statistical truth. It survived not because it avoided damage, but because its designers and a refugee mathematician learned which damage mattered. Wald saw the ghosts of the planes that never returned. By seeing them, he saved the living.